Okay, are we on? Okay, welcome to the panel about the future. I'll read the description here so everybody can start talking about what we're supposed to be talking about instead of drifting off into divergent streams of God knows what, as most panelists do. It's difficult to write fiction in the near future when technology has changed both rapidly and at a snail's pace compared to what writers of the last few decades imagined. How does one even begin to tackle writing alternative futures, which requires extrapolation about both future and past? Panelists will discuss the different approaches to building alternate futures. Okay, let's get started. I'll start off by having our panelists introduce themselves and give some justification for why they're on this panel. We'll start with Jim Beall. Jim?
My name is Jim Beall. I'm a nuclear engineer. I've dealt extensively in the nuclear field and the energy field in general for about 50 years now. And I've been reading science fiction for even longer than that. Reason why I wanted to be on this panel was because technology is one of the things that drives. It says that clothes may make the man, but I've always felt it was technologies that make the culture. So one way to affect culture is to affect technology. And one of the easiest ways to affect technology is to change what energy is available to the people who want to do things. That's why I wanted to be on the panel.
Kelly?
I am Kelly Robson. I am a Canadian short fiction writer, fantasy, science fiction, and horror. I love history. I'm mostly here because I want to hear what everyone says. And yeah, I'm happy to be here this morning on Sunday morning, coming to you from Toronto. One of my interests in extrapolating futures is economics.
Good luck with that.
And I was kind of hit between the eyes at the beginning of the pandemic, when the near futures that I had been writing about and designing for myself for years suddenly took a pandemic turn.
So do you have any stock tips for us? It'll be later in the broadcast.
That's me.
So everyone who's on, make sure you stay on to get those stock tips. I'm Ted Weber. I'm an ecologist, and I'm also a speculative fiction author. My latest novel, Born in Salt, was just released this month. It's an alternate history novel, and I've also written a near future cyberpunk trilogy, with parts of which have gone from near future science fiction to alternate history, because I started it in about 2010. So I'll talk a little bit about particulars of that.
And my name is Buzz Sparhawk. I am a short fiction writer mostly, although I've written 3 or 4 novels, I think, on loose count. Thinking about something John Scalzi said a few years ago, and I don't think he was the originator of this. He said that science fiction writers predict the future the way a duck hunter hits a duck with a shotgun. You know, sometimes we make a correct prediction, and most of the time we don't. But still, it's an interesting exercise to explore and just let your mind run and figure out which way things are going to go. Let me tell a little personal story here. I wrote a story a few years ago in which I posited a day in the life of a man with all kinds of far future stuff around. And it took 2 months after it was bought before it got published. A month later, everything in that story was in existence. Everything, the smart clothing, the running shoes with music, and et cetera, et cetera. It was quite a revelation. So I'm chary of anything dealing with the near future. I prefer to deal in the far future when God knows what it will be like. Does anybody else have anything to say? I hope I'm not going to talk the whole panel.
So I started my near future cyberpunk trilogy. I started writing it in 2010, but the first book didn't actually come out until 2016. So I first decided, well, I'm going to set it in 2020. Then I realized, well, I'm writing a trilogy and I'll be lucky if I finish it by then. So I set it out to like 2030. I don't give a date, but a lot of the things that I include in it, a lot of the technology and some of the trends have already come to pass. And then some other things have happened that I did not predict at all, like Donald Trump being president. I certainly never, maybe the Simpsons could predict that, but I couldn't have. Yeah, some of the technology and then things like government and corporate surveillance, those have come true. VR, virtual reality, shared virtual reality. So we have VR chat now. Tiny surveillance, flying surveillance drones that are really, really tiny. Those are out now, and of course there are drones everywhere. Drones that can see through walls. Those have been developed. So, and then shared virtual reality. So a lot of stuff, a lot of the technology has already come true, and unfortunately, some of the social aspects of the technology, like surveillance, and then also things like I'll get back to it in a second. I'm not quite awake yet.
We're at such a weird time right now where we really don't, maybe a year and a half ago, we could predict what the future would look like with some sort of confidence, wealth concentrating in cities, decline of private cars, brain drains from the country, brain drains from other countries going to wealthier countries, that sort of thing. Those seemed like trends that weren't going to stop. And now we honestly really don't know, right? We just don't know.
The pandemic has certainly thrown a wrench in things, and a year of social isolation. What I was trying to remember before was net neutrality. So one of the themes was the concentration of media and concentration of technology and internet access. So we used to have this net neutrality, which allows content providers to people to freely access that. But after Trump was elected, he overturned that. He appointed a former Verizon lawyer as head of the FCC, and they overturned net neutrality, which opens the door to big internet service providers intentionally favoring websites and content that they own if they want, or have to pay a premium. And this former Verizon lawyer, Ajit Pai, actually joked in a Verizon meeting that, we'll make sure that Verizon content gets favored, and this will be a great thing for Verizon. Ha ha.
Jim, you're muted.
That events will drive our focus on certain things. And so an event can cause a focus change. For example, this COVID situation we're in right now, look how that's changed where everyone's attention is on certain kinds of technology, certain kinds of apps, certain kinds of products. A lot of times an alternate history can be driven by an event that then spawns change on its own. So if you miss an event like the pandemic, you will not be able to predict history. Whereas on the other hand, if you're an author, you can have an event in your story, and it again creates another divergence from history that allows you to explore the effects of a possibility. This was used a lot by a lot of other fiction writers in the past. They would want to highlight a problem, and so they would dramatize it and focus it by having an event occur that drives everybody in that direction.
All writers write about the present, regardless of whether they set it in the future or not. You can't escape the current culture.
Right. And so you could add, like Jim said, an event that propels the world or worlds in that direction, so you can explore the ramifications. or you can explore the emergence of technology, like looking at where technology is now and then extrapolating whether that extrapolation is based on like researching trends or like, looking at scientific journals or technical journals and seeing what is being worked on now and saying, well, it'll take maybe 10 years for that to be the engineering kinks to be worked out and for it to be deployed at scale, or maybe 10 or 20 years or however long. 10 years is probably a good figure. So I did a lot of that, and some of the technology evolved faster than I had expected or in slightly different directions.
There are also different things. You can also, as a writer, postulate that an actual historical event played out a little differently, or maybe a lot differently. One of the historic, I hate to say historic in this context, but one of the more famous alternate histories came about when a person decided to write that the Black Death killed 4 times as many people in Europe than it actually did. It basically was almost a wipeout. Another version would be, what if Rome fell to Hannibal? There was no Roman Empire in the AD scene at all. Another one that's more subtle is the Library of Alexandria did not burn down. So all that stored knowledge was preserved for future generations. And there's also, writers can find little wrinkles in history. For example, one I came across just recently was, people don't really realize, most people who are not historians, I came across it accidentally. In 26 BC, Rome invaded Arabia. They staged because they wanted to get control of Southern Arabia, where a lot of the trade routes were. And it failed, but it could have succeeded. It could easily have succeeded. The guy made a lot of mistakes. If it succeeds in Southern Arabia, the coast of Arabia becomes a Roman province, it is entirely possible that Islam never becomes a powerful religion, and there's no upsurgence that actually occurred in history. Those are some historical things in the past that an author could write about in a future that plays out now as it propagated away from that. But there are more recent ones as well, but I'll speak them when I get another chance.
Yeah, I'm thinking, brought to mind Stephen Barnes's Lion's Blood series, which postulates Islamic colonization of North America.
Harry Turtledove has certainly written lots and lots of alternate history. So my new novel, Born in Salt, is an alternate history saga about totalitarianism and resistance and addiction. And that was based on a real event, the business plot in 1933 to overthrow President Roosevelt and install a dictator. And the premise is that they didn't choose General Butler, who ended up turning them in. They chose someone else, and the coup was successful. And then it looks at what the US and the world is like 50 years later, through the eyes of a small town kid who's 19 and who's drawn into the resistance kind of against his will. So that's, and I wrote that after realizing that my cyberpunk novels were becoming alternate history. So why not write an actual alternate history novel?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're focusing a little too much, I think, on the mechanical aspects of the future in our writing. When our writing is getting more character driven and has more emotional depth than it did back in the pulp days. But even so, we're still seeing far future stories that have the mores of today. The roles of men and women are not much altered, even in the most liberal of books that have come out. So how do we address the issue of the change in societies without getting too much into the mechanics?
One of the things that I deal with a lot is the professionalization of child rearing. If you have a human expansion across solar systems or the solar system, my question is always, where are all the kids coming from? Where's your population coming from? Because it's certainly not coming from, the nuclear family. So professionalization of child rearing, artificial wombs, how would that work? And I don't necessarily, I take quite a sympathetic view of it. I think it could work. So that's one thing I focus on a lot in several of my stories.
Yeah, I should remind everybody about Fred Poole's story, Day Million, in which a lot of the so-called far future concepts in there are possible today. Artificial insemination, gene modification. We haven't got to the spaceships yet, but all the social things are in there.
So Ursula K. Le Guin handled that so in her Hainish universe, she has a lot of different cultures, and some of them are explored by anthropologists, so the story can like really dive into the culture. And by having different cultures on different planets, she can explore different types of future societies, which I think is a really cool way to do it.
And we have a great moment of silence here as everybody trying to think of something clever to say. I'm sorry I don't have some.
Well, let me have one then.
You always
have one then. Let's look at some recent events that you could explore that would have led to an alternate history. Some of them, again, are ones you might not expect. Everyone knows in my field, for example, that where nuclear energy came from, it came from the Manhattan Project. But not as many people remember that Manhattan Project began because of a letter that Einstein agreed to sign, because he was the most recognized name, that went to Franklin D. Roosevelt in July of 1939. And FDR finally got the letter, not just a few months after that, and read it, was so impressed that was one of the major factors why the Manhattan Project began. Repeating what the Manhattan Project did with better technology is not that hard today. It is very difficult with the technology of the time to do the Manhattan Project. It took an enormous amount of resources. Well, in 1947, Einstein revealed that the reason why he had signed that letter was he had been convinced by a couple of physicists that Germany might develop the nuclear bomb.
Yes.
Right.
And when he found out how far away Germany really was from anything of the sort, he was quoted as saying, I'm going to read the quotation here. Had I known that the Germans would not succeed in developing an atomic bomb, I would have done nothing. So there would have been no Manhattan Project. So how does that change the world? There's nuclear energy will come in its time, but without the Manhattan Project behind it, it's probably a generation later. That would really change a lot of things.
That's so
Maybe.
interesting, because what you're taking out of the world is this huge amount of fear.
Maybe because of the Cold War, they would have been developed nuclear weapons.
Why was there a Cold War?
Anyway,
why was there a Cold War?
There was a Cold War partly because of ideological differences between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and that started before the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, which some of the technology of which they pilfered from the US.
We can disagree on exactly how the Cold War would have played out. And in fact, that sounds like alternate history novels all by itself. But I believe without the parity, the global parity that USSR had by being able to deliver a nuclear bomb anywhere they wanted, the Cold War would have played out entirely differently, if it would have even sustained itself. But again, it's a thing to be debated.
And what if the Soviet Union had developed it first?
But I'm trying to tell you that the Manhattan Project was a unique moment in history where we had a government that was all focused on one thing and was willing to devote an enormous amount of material resources and brain power on a sustained effort. If we did that today with the same level of commitment, with the same level of percentage of our scientists, we could be out the edge of the solar system by the time they built the atomic bomb.
Well, the Apollo program was also a huge effort, maybe not
on the same scale.
And you're changing the history of not just the US and the USSR, but the whole world.
Yes.
All the South American coups and initiatives that were supported by the various regimes around the world wouldn't have happened. Africa would probably be in a better position. Yeah. Interesting.
we're talking about direct consequences of things for alternative histories, but there are also unintended consequences that happen to things that create the world we have today. For example, containerized shipping, which moves vast amounts of commercial products from around countries, across oceans, and even within countries. That came about simply because one of the shippers got pissed off at the longshoreman stealing from his cargo, and decided to get a truck, load it up, lock it up, and ship it that to protect what was inside.
Excellent.
Now we have a global economy that's based on shipping. So unintended consequences are one thing that I haven't seen any stories dealing with that.
Haven't we always had a global economy based on shipping, or at least regional economies based on shipping?
Not to the extent we have today.
Not when it's global like that. There's a fantastic book by Rose George called 90% of Everything: Inside Shipping, the Invisible Industry That Puts Clothes on Your Back, Gas in Your Car, and Food on Your Plate. It's fantastic. Really good investigative nonfiction book.
One of the unintended consequences of global trade and travel is the spread of invasive plants and diseases and animals, other invasive organisms all around the world, which have had really catastrophic ecological and health consequences. COVID-19 is an obvious example, but also ecological pathogens that have come from Asia or Europe, like the chestnut blight that wiped out the entire, like a quarter of the trees in the Appalachians, the white nose syndrome, which has killed millions and millions of bats in like 2000, starting in 2006. And there are many, many, many examples of this. So that's an unintended consequence of globalization.
There was a book by Asimov. I think it's got Eternity, End of Eternity, maybe, in which an entire organization existed outside the boundaries of time. And they were concerned with trying to manipulate the Earth's time stream in ways that were judged to be the best. And the rule of thumb was the best thing to do was the smallest change possible for the greatest consequences. And the reason why the one I mentioned has always been a favorite of mine is that all it took was one signature on one document. Now, there are other events. Take the one we have right now. Suppose COVID had mutated faster than it has, and it changed enough so that the vaccines were not successful against it. And its death body count got an order of magnitude larger than it looks like it's going to be. How would that change things?
Well, I think the consequence of COVID is more on the social scene than it is on the medical scene. I mean, our behaviors have changed. Congregating in crowds does not seem very smart anymore.
It's huge on the economic scene as well. It'll be really interesting to see what happens when things open back up again. We're going to have a huge economic boom. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, I just think it's nice that we have toilet paper in the stores again.
And what if, so genetic technology has capabilities have increased exponentially and will continue to do so most likely. What if in the near future or slightly more distant future, anyone can create any sort of organism, and terrorists decide to create a weapon that can, a pathogen that they release all over the world? You know, how awful would that be?
Well, as a writer, I would ask the authors who write fiction on the panel, what would you want an event, a change, an altered history? What would you want it to do? What would you enjoy writing about?
in the past or looking at the future?
Well, look at the panel title.
Didn't Jin Men write about Romans invading North America and spreading through there, having their influence on the various Indian cultures as they moved across what we now call the United States? That was an alternate past that came to an alternate future, an alternate past.
Correct.
Yeah.
I wrote a story that I'm in the process of editing, but it's kind of low on the stack. So it's a long epic fantasy novel where survivors of a catastrophic future in Earth are able to influence Earth's past, and they try to influence it from the very beginnings of civilization by instilling a different type of way of thinking about the world that's more sustainable, and then it explores what happens after they leave and different branches. And another way that they look at history, they look at timelines as being more than one timeline, multiple timelines, and then looking at it in terms of probabilities. So the timelines with the greatest probabilities are the strongest, and ones with a very small probability are less important. And so they're trying to maximize the number of timelines with positive outcomes and performing experiments and doing adaptive management to try to maximize the number of positive timelines. And so the book though looks at one of the ones where they performed an experiment and are letting it go. So they are leaving, and so it kind of looks at a different version of a world war after a natural catastrophe. And but the short of it is it's looking at timeline manipulation from the very beginnings, and then trying to tweak them as the timelines go on.
Annalee Newitz's Future of Another Timeline has something similar, where in our time, or in our recent history, time travel was invented or discovered, and it just creates a mess of a future. It'd be so difficult to keep that locked down.
Actually, time travel's been invented 1,000 times, but those are all on different timelines.
Too true, too true.
A simple technological change is one of the things I mentioned earlier. Very simple, very possible technology change that would have changed history. I'll give you one. The Romans used concrete extensively. That's why so many of their buildings in Rome are still there. They're made out of concrete, not of stone. If you try to reuse the material, you just get rubble, but it takes a lot of energy to tear the building down. So what happens is the buildings are still there, and the parts that could be reused, like marble and bronze, are gone. A lot of the buildings, like the Parthenon, was built in under 10 years, mostly out of concrete. The secret of how you make concrete was lost when Rome fell, and was not discovered for over 1,000 years. It was discovered when someone retranslated a Latin text from AD 15 that included how you made concrete. And after a few experiments, by God, it actually works. In 1499, they built the first building out of concrete. Yet that document, they've been able to find so far 78 copies of that document that survived the entire 1,000 years. And so it could have been retranslated by anybody all over Europe or even beyond Europe for 1,000 years. Remember the cathedrals that took hundreds of years to build? Rome built the Parthenon, which is the size of a cathedral, in under 10 years, about 8. You remember how long it takes to build castles and how hard it was for lords to have these powerful castles? In concrete, you could build them in under a year, maybe a few months. How does that change history? It changes it dramatically. You don't have to quarry as much, and there are a lot more concrete around.
It's a good one.
That sounds a lot like your recycling talk yesterday, which was a really great talk.
Well, thank you. It's part of it. I saved it as this can do double duty in two
Yes,
channels.
copy and paste.
I have an alien invasion story, which is a bit of answer to Tiptree's screwfly solution, where the invading aliens, in accordance with their ethics, decide to take over Earth, and they cannot kill off all of humanity. So they just decide to kill off all of the men on Earth. And that changes absolutely everything.
You think? There's another aspect that that we have on this thing is are writers today talking differently about the future than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago? I mean, I can remember reading stories in the 1950s, in which people were still using slide rules on spaceships on there. The, you know.
Well, one thing that's interesting is the oscillation between projecting good futures and bad futures. So in the classic science fiction, like the golden age of science fiction, there were a lot of, utopian societies in the future. And then maybe in the 60s and 70s and I don't know, maybe up until now, dystopians got much more popular, especially like in the last maybe 20 years. Everyone was writing dystopias, and the pendulum, thankfully, is turning the other way, where people are writing solar punk and hope punk and other, I guess, more hopeful stories about the future, saying, well, it doesn't have to be bad. We can create a better future.
But there is a large segment of humanity that wants things to be bad. They don't want things to turn out well. They just want things to stay the same as they are forever, eternity.
Well,
I would note that dystopia.
Yeah, that's a little bit. That's more of a reactionary mindset rather than wanting the future to be bad. In their mind, it's good. What they think, what's in their mind is good, and so why change it? Same for people that have created, who have created unspeakable horrors like Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot. They thought, well, we're making a better society, and that's a good thing. But of course, we know that it was not a good thing at all. But in their minds, they're the hero. Everyone's the hero of their own story. So the saying goes.
Well, one of the consequences of the Black Death was that the general health of the Europeans improved. People got larger. They had better access to food. They had more. There was more hygiene, I guess. Once they got rid of the dead bodies. So there. Evelyn Pay had an interesting question in the Q&A, asking about alternative history developing after a certain point in time because of the discovery of new technology or resource, and how it affect multiple different aspects of society. I think that touches on something that I think was popular a while when we called it steam engine time. When you get society and technology gets to a certain point where it has to be invented, who invents it or gets there first is just a matter of chance. The telephone was invented 3 times. One man made it on there. So any comments on that?
What is exactly are you asking, Bud?
Well, the idea that society and the whole culture creates conditions where something has to be invented.
I agree with that. In fact,
somebody will invent it.
Well, again, there were people like Leonardo da Vinci who probably could have invented a great many things if the technology today was superior to what he actually had to deal with. A lot of times the technology occurs because of a melding together, a meshing together of the surrounding technology that allows you to implement something, and plus the need to invent it. A lot of people were trying to invent the airplane all at the same time. A great many people around the turn of the 1900s. The Wright brothers were successful for a couple main reasons. One, they found out that a lot of the basic data everybody was using was wrong. It always based on guesswork, and a lot of the guesses were wrong. So they had to redo their own experiments and get it right, and they did. And two, and this is one that people don't realize as much, they were able to have an engine that was powerful enough yet light enough to provide the horsepower they needed. And the main reason why they were able to do that was because their mechanic guy was able to get a block of aluminum and machine it into an engine. And that was only possible because the Pittsburgh Reduction Company had gotten the very first contract of Niagara Falls to use the new electrolysis process to make bulk aluminum. Without aluminum, Wright brothers can't fly their plane. So yes, technology and surrounding technology and the need.
It's interesting to think of what needs do we have right now that aren't being filled, aren't being helped. There's a lot of medical situations that just are intractable.
Like Alzheimer's, and there are a lot of genetic diseases that, but there's so much resources and effort is being poured into genetics and curing diseases, especially after the amazing success, I think, with finding a vaccine for COVID-19 in such a relatively short period of time, because so much resources were thrown at the problem. So that, I think that will have ramifications, and I think that will speed up the curing of future diseases, because so much research has been done, and the realization that how valuable genetic research is.
There's a really interesting, damn, I'm not going to be able to remember. Is it in This American Life? About people trying to invent a simple stove that can be that can be set up in a person's home in developing nations, that will use whatever fuel they have at hand, that won't blow up, that won't poison everyone with the off-gassing, and is reliable. And how just it is an engineering problem that still hasn't been solved, but that could have huge consequences for millions of people around the world. And
there are NGOs that are delivering those sorts of stoves to rural villages in developing countries, and also small solar panels that they can charge cell phones and things like that with, or lights, like so that's not a lot of power, but it's just enough to charge a phone or provide light so they can read and study at night, which is great for kids going to school. They can do their homework they have light to look at. The stoves are, I don't remember that, it's not an advanced technology at all, but it's compact stoves that they're not wood-based or charcoal-based, that produces all this and requires the cutting down of trees that we can't afford, or they can't afford to cut down because they're needed to keep the land from turning a desert.
Calvin Beam just asked an interesting question, and it's more a technical question to writers on here. Wanted to know how we brainstorm the impact of changes. Do we actually work off a checklist, or do we make up a checklist as we go, or do we just make it up as we go along? For myself, I think the characterization and what takes place between the characters is the most important thing that happens. And then you build the plot around, and then you invent a technology that so you can sell it to science fiction magazines instead of Collier's or some other thing. was a joke. I just said two guys on a desert island, and one guy saying to the other, God, if this shipwreck hadn't happened, I'd be a top man at Colliers by now.
Yeah, I start with the plot and characters first also, but sort of weaving them together. And then the setting comes after that, and technology is part of the setting, but sometimes the technology is a very important part of the plot. That in science fiction, technology is often a very important part of the plot, even if it's not the main driver of the plot or the book. The characters often were usually being the main actual driver.
Well, I have to point out, as I've had on many other panels, is what we call science fiction isn't really science fiction. It's really engineering fiction, because the people in there, you very seldom see a story about a scientist doing actually boring scientific work. Usually it's about the application of a scientific discovery or the implementation of it that the story revolves around.
Or it could be a scientific discovery, though.
I have a story out at the Realm podcast where a scientist at the very beginning of the pandemic is working very hard on his cancer research, and his sister, who is a robotics engineer, decides to gift him a repurposed sex bot to help him with his very mind-numbingly boring rote tasks to do his research, like shuffling, preparing slides, that sort of thing.
I would say, Bud, that sometimes authors have a effect or a cultural change that they want to explore with their characters in a story, but they don't know how to do it. They realize they have to introduce change to make it so. I've had a couple science fiction writers contact me and ask me, would this technology do this? Or how would I get a technology to do that? So what they were looking for was a way to cause the situation that their characters would be exploring. So you can come at it in different ways. Those people were wanted to work backwards from where they wanted to get.
And other writers just make things up.
All right. Well, that's what fiction is. It's making stuff up.
Yes. Yeah, usually when I'm writing and I need a gadget in there, I just write TBD and go on with the story, because the story is more important than the detail like that. And then I go back later and figure out where is there something that could be developed into that something. And sometimes the research is more interesting than actually writing the story.
I believe you're talking about Trek Babble.
Then you deploy the hand wavium and.
Yeah, we're getting close to the end here. At this point, in a real panel, we would look at the audience and say, "Are there any questions?" But I see they've been coming in like a rainstorm over here.
Lots of
Q&A, and a lot more of them are appearing over in the chat. Too much that I can keep track of, as a matter of fact.
So somebody says, are there any books you read that when they were written about near future events surprised how close they were and really missed the mark? Somebody else in the chat mentioned Sarah Pinsker's damn it, Song for a New Day, which came out shortly before the pandemic and absolutely nailed our isolation. Like that one, just to mention it.
One of the things I thought about during the pandemic is how similar this is to The Machine Stops, the old classic in there. We're all huddled in our private places, not interacting at all. And what happens when the machine stops? What happens if the internet went down, for example, during the height of COVID? You know, I think most of my neighbors would have gone crazy.
Yeah, what would have happened if this pandemic had occurred 10 or 20 years earlier?
Yeah.
Yeah, we wouldn't have been able to stay inside.
In 2012, there was a corona mass ejection event on the sun that would have been very similar to the Carrington event of 1859, and it narrowly missed the Earth. if it would have impacted the Earth like the one in 1959 did, which was so powerful that telegraph operators could send messages without any power in the lines. And people were getting their hands burnt by touching the lines, just without any power in them. They were just induced by the solar activity. If that occurred in 2012, would have hit the Earth, the internet would have gone down and it would have stayed down. A lot of the power plants would have gone down.
I think I've just been warned that it's time to wrap it up. So final words, Jim? Kelly?
All right, I'll give you one. Writing of alternate history is nothing new. It's not something that we've invented as writers and as people for the last 20 or 30 years. The earliest one I've been able to find is by the Roman historian Livy, Livy, who wrote back in the days of the Roman Empire, what would have happened if their legions would have fought Alexander the Great? And he sketched it out as to how he was sure the Romans would have won. So we're not doing anything new. We're just
Kelly?
So there's no wrong way to do it. Choose what interests you, what fascinates you, what you just can't stop thinking about, and write about that. And you know, if you don't get it right in the first draft, there's always the second draft, third draft, 10th draft. Just do it. Just write it. Whatever you're passionate about.
Would that life was like that.
It's the job of a lot of people in policy, like think tanks and some military think tanks and non-military think tanks, to try to predict the future. But as fiction writers, we have more latitude, and we can play with it a lot more, and look at all sorts of alternate things, scenarios, some of which may come true, most of which probably won't. And I guess a quick plug, again, my name is T.C. Weber. I have an alternate history novel, Born and Salt, that just came out. And I have a near future cyberpunk trilogy out also. And you can find me at tcweber.com and elsewhere on the internet.
Okay, thank you all for participating. It's nice seeing your faces again.
You too.
We could have done this for real, but we take what we have. Thank you very much.
Next time, next year.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.